the things that I've been following is in the area of Daniel 9. Daniel 9 is always touted as one of the most crucial passages that Christians use to prove the Messiah or the Christ. And you have done a marvelous job trying to explain that. One of the things that nobody was able to explain is why did the 70 weeks actually uh, was told to Daniel that as he was anticipating 70 years to come by, that there will be another 70 weeks of years. Uh, and Christians just use numbers to calculate, but without understanding the background as to why this actually is taking place. What exactly is happening?
Well, the key to understanding Daniel 9 is looking at the very first verse. You know, the reason why I really care about Christians a lot is because I know what they're not taught. It's not that they don't want to be taught, it's not that they're not hungry to learn, but no one teaches them Hebrew. And in this case, no one teaches them Daniel 9, verse 1. That means that virtually every Christian in the world who's ever learned Daniel 9 begins with verse 24, those last four passages. I could say that with complete confidence that 99.999, many digits over, virtually there's no Christian on the planet. That's a lot of people. That's 2 billion people. That's nearly a third of the world's population have heard of Daniel 9, verse 24 through 27, and virtually not a single one of them read Daniel 9, verse 1 prior to reading those passages. Do you know how toxic that is to skip the first 23 verses of any chapter and, like a helicopter, land toward the end of a chapter? That's what Christians are doing. They're landing, they're hovering and just landing somewhere in a chapter or somewhere in a book, let alone not reading Daniel chapter 8, chapter 7, they learn a little bit. This is a nightmare. And this is why my heart goes out to them. I know it goes on. So the first thing to understand Daniel 9, and the reason why Christians don't get it, is because they don't read the first just 5 words of the whole chapter. They don't read it. They're taught this. I know what's going on, even though I didn't go to Christian school. They're going, here's a fulfillment card. Memorize these verses. It's about Christ. And what puzzles me is that Christians don't go, but shouldn't we learn the whole chapter? They're like so exuberant. They're so excited that there's some sort of verse that predicts the exact date of Jesus' crucifixion, that they don't, it's like, it's like a child receiving a birthday present and just rips open the box and goes to the present, didn't read the card, doesn't look at the wrapping, doesn't see who gives it, doesn't care. Afterwards, maybe 2 years later, this is what's happening. This is the truth. This is how they're taught it. It's not their fault. I blame the churches for this. Christians will be so eager to learn Hebrew. Christians will be so eager to learn this chapter. The chapter begins in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the seed of Media. That's the whole story. And everyone goes, what do you mean that's the whole story? What do you mean? Kanapa, what is that? What's going on here? Those words should send off an explosion in the mind of the reader. This means that what we read earlier has been fulfilled. the Babylonian Empire has come to an end. This is a shocker historically. You know, the Babylonian Empire was a world superpower. The world superpower. It's like the United States today. It would be hard to imagine that such a power could suddenly just end. But there are prophecies associated with this ending. And Daniel's in a state of shock. So you have the Babylonian Empire, which lasted for 70 years, as predicted in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 25, verse 12. The context in Jeremiah 25, it's so important for you to know, is Jeremiah is encouraging his fellow Jews, don't rebel against Babylon. Babylon, after all, is only going to last for 70 years. Now, Jeremiah is saying this in the heat of the Babylonian Empire, prior to the destruction of the first temple. A caveat, historically, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, the empire, emerged 19 years prior to the destruction of the first temple of King Solomon's temple. So Jeremiah spends much of his very large book pleading with the Jews, don't fight with Babylon, God is not on your side. It's pretty straightforward, right? Daniel sees what's in Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a much older person than Daniel, but they actually lived at the same time. So Jeremiah is much older, but Daniel was only 14 when he was brought to Babylon. So they certainly lived, almost certainly lived at the exact same time, except Jeremiah is much older. The key is that Daniel sees this prophecy, and he sees another prophecy a few chapters later in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 10. And the prophecy seems very similar. Almost any reasonable person reading Jeremiah 29 would think it's simply a repeat of 25. In chapter 29, it tells us not only about Babylon and 70 years, but I will fulfill my good word, devorii, toward you, and restore you to this place. This means Jerusalem. This means the land of Israel. This means the restoration of the Jews. A caveat, from the time the temple was destroyed, the first temple was destroyed, technically from the time of the assassination of Gedaliah, which took place like a month and a half later, that means from Rosh Hashanah, the first day of the 7th month of the year that the first temple was destroyed, until the rise of Darius the Mede, who would almost immediately be followed by Cyrus. But they're both the Medo-Persia Empire, same thing. That was a period of 50 years past. For those 50 years, it's the only time in history that there was not a Jew in the land of Israel since the time of Joshua. No Jews for 50 years. Okay, it's very, very important. So Cyrus is about to give the command for the Jews to return. He doesn't give it yet because he hasn't emerged yet. There's about an 11-month period in between. I hope I don't confuse you. The key is that Daniel conflates two 70-year prophecies found in close proximity to each other in the book of Jeremiah, and believes that if Babylon is going to be around for 70 years and the Babylonian Empire has just collapsed, he believed that the Jews should be returning to the land of Israel at the same time as when the Babylonian Empire collapsed. Those two things should happen simultaneously. And Daniel is petrified, is horrified, a much better word. What's wrong? Everything is wrong in Daniel's view. Because if that's the case, it's true that Babylon has collapsed. Granted. But Jews aren't going anywhere. The Jews are right here. There's no return, nothing, not a hint. And that's why the chapter begins within the first year of Darius the Mede. Because Daniel is appalled. He's shocked, horrified. What is he scared of? He tells us, later on in the chapter, he tells us what he's so scared of. He's afraid that God has brought about a curse found in Leviticus chapter 26. His worst nightmare, he believes, has just unfolded. Leviticus 26 is a very sharp chapter which contains the blessings and the curses. And in that chapter, verse 18 in particular, we are told that if the Jews, after they're punished, continue to sin, then their punishment will be multiplied 7 times. If the original punishment was 70-year exile, and it was multiplied by 7, Daniel was horrified that perhaps a 70-year Babylonian exile has been converted into a mind-blowing 490-year exile. And Daniel begins to pray like no prophet has ever entreated God in the past. He begins to weep before God, pleading for the restoration of the sanctuary, pleading that this should be overturned. When people ask me, why do I care so much about Christians? This is the reason why. There's almost not a Christian on the planet that knows this. They don't read this. They don't know why Daniel's praying, who is he talking to, why is he... They don't learn it. They're not taught this in Christian schools. They're not. They're deprived of this information. And that's why Christians think we, the Jews, are crazy. This is why Christians think that there is a veil over the eyes of the Jews. This is why Christians think that Paul was right in 2 Corinthians 3, that there are scales over the eyes of the Jews. This is why Christians think that the Jews are blind, and that's why we reject Christ. This is the reason. Because they're reading these passages completely out of context. There's a soaring, ecstatic prayer that Daniel begins to bring before God, pleading with him that the curse in the law of Moses should not be brought to bear, pleading with him. The angel Gabriel is sent to Daniel to explain to him how to calculate. Now, I'm going to summarize this, and actually we are told this in Daniel already 9:2, that the time to begin the counting is not when Jerusalem was subjugated, a year after Nebuchadnezzar became king, or 18 years prior to the destruction of the first temple, but rather l'chorvot Yerushalayim, from the destruction of Jerusalem. That's what's key. Don't begin the count for Jeremiah 29, verse 10, until the first temple is destroyed. That's when that clock is launched. So the clock, the stopwatch begins ticking for Jeremiah 25 when Jerusalem is subjugated. That's 18 years prior to the destruction of the first temple. However, the second stopwatch for 70 years begins clicking, is triggered at the destruction of the first temple. And therefore, nothing has been abrogated. And Gabriel, the angel, brings into view for Daniel not just when the Jewish people would return back to the land, but all of Jewish history for the next 420 years, and bring into view 490 years, given that Daniel is saying this 50 years after the destruction of the first temple. So 490 years is now going to come into view to Daniel by the angel Gabriel. One caveat: in these prophecies, it's not only here, but in these types of prophecies, the angel is going to use days to signify years. So in this case, 7 years is a week. 70 years is 7 years is a week, which is a week of years, which means 7 years. And 70 years means 490 years. Why? So I'll explain it quickly. Why is they using such unusual language? It's not that unusual. This is taken from Leviticus chapter 25. We know from the end of Chronicles that the reason why there was a 70-year exile altogether is the Jews abandoned the law of Shemitah, not touching the land for 6 years. They violated that, and that's why on the 7th year they had to allow the land to lie fallow. They violated that, so the exile was 70 years. This is the language of Leviticus chapter 25. And Daniel is about to understand what Jeremiah was foretelling in Jeremiah 29, verse 10. The trigger point is the destruction of the first temple, l'chorvot Yerushalayim. If you start counting it from there, past 7 weeks from the going forth of the word. Now, when the prophet and the angel use the word here, Hebrew word devar or devari. See Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 10. The word there is devari, my word. See the beginning of Ezra. The word begins. The completion of the word. What does this word mean here? It means more than verba, just a word. It means the word of prophecy, the launch of a prophecy from when the temple is destroyed to when the Jews would return. This is very critical. If you don't understand this, you can go home. You'll never understand any of this. See the first 5 passages of Ezra to complete the word of Jeremiah. Same word, devar. See the end of Chronicles. Okay, so it's very important. The angel Gabriel is using language that's not completely conventional. The word means word of prophecy, which is launched when? When Nebuchadnezzar subjugated Jerusalem 18 years prior to destruction? No. From when the first temple, from when King Solomon's temple was destroyed. Counting from that point, from the going forth of the word until the command to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple by a Mashiach Nogid, an anointed prince, will be 7 weeks. How long is 7 weeks? That's 49 years. Who arose after 49 years on the 50th year following the destruction of the first temple, who God calls my Mashiach, who God calls a Messiah, who is also Nugget, who is of royalty, a royal prince. Who is that? We know exactly who that is. The Bible says so. Where? See Isaiah 45, verse 1. I would see the verse that precedes it, and that's Isaiah 44:28. 44:28 ends, and the next chapter, 45, verse 1, begins. That chapter break is artificial. We didn't do it. Okay, so put those 2 passages together. It is Cyrus, the Kyrish in Hebrew. Cyrus gives the command for the Jews to return to Jerusalem, to rebuild Jerusalem, and to rebuild their temple. And the Jews go back. All the Jews go back? No. The Jews go back. This is how the book of Ezra begins. Problem. People don't read the book of Ezra. This is a big problem. This is how the whole book of Ezra begins. This is why the book of Ezra should really follow the book of Daniel. The Christians don't want that. If the book of Ezra followed Daniel in a Christian Bible, some Christians would be saved of this foolishness. Some Christians might be saved, might be rescued, but it doesn't in the Christian order of books. In the Jewish order of books, it does. This is the reason. No one would even dream this up. What happens? Daniel is made to understand the history of the Jewish people from the destruction of the first temple, destruction of the second temple. The second temple stood for 420 years. The Babylonian exile was 70 years. 70 plus 420 is 490 years. Bingo. What comes into view is the distance of time from destruction of the first temple, destruction of the second temple, but is broken into parts. The angel Gabriel gives Daniel more information. From the destruction of the first temple until Cyrus, 7 weeks. That's 49 years have to pass. It does. Next year, Cyrus emerges. In the intermediate period between the destruction of Babylon, which is predicted earlier, the writing on the wall, which is predicted earlier, and the emergence of Cyrus the Great, is a small period, less than a year, with Darius the Mede, who's probably Cyrus's father-in-law, rules. So Daniel's right in that spot. I call it a sweet spot, but for Daniel, this was a bitter spot. Because Daniel sees the destruction of Babylon, but doesn't see Cyrus yet. Get it? I hope you get this, because if you get it, you're going to go flying. But then also the angel brings into view bad times, very bad times. The last week of this 490-year period, the last 7 years, from 63 to 70. What happens halfway through? If 63 is the beginning of the last week, Nero is emperor, and the week ends with the destruction of the second temple, that's the year 70, what happens in 66? Everybody knows this. I mean, everyone who has some even perfunctory knowledge of Jewish history, superficial knowledge of Jewish history, knows that in the year 66, the Jews go to war with the Romans. It's a bad, bad moment. What did the Romans do? The agreement that the Jews had with the empire to allow the sacrificial system to continue, to allow the temple, the ecclesiastical order of the second temple to continue, is brought to a halt. A half a week, meaning 3.5 years prior to destruction of the second temple. And then at the end of it, the people of the prince, that's the Roman Empire, come down like a flood. You know the history. The emperor was Vespasian. His son, may he perish in hell, Titus, the wicked one. Titus Hirusha was the military general that destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the land of Israel, destroyed the Commonwealth, destroyed the temple, and brought in idolatry, and you know the rest of the story. That's what Daniel is all about. Christians, it's so magnificent, but Christians seek to misappropriate these passages and have them talking about Jesus' death. Now, the way they get away with this stunt is the following. The word Messiah appears in the Hebrew Bible 39 times. The Hebrew word is Mashiach. The word Mashiach appears in a Hebrew Bible 39 times. In the old days, it was hard. You had to look that up, but you have it all on computer now. In 2 seconds, you can look that up. As it turns out, in all 39 times, it is not referring to the Messiah, but rather it's referring to someone who's anointed. And Christian Bibles, not all of them, but those with a bad criminal rap sheet, the usual suspects, in 37 of those times, render the word Mashiach as anointed, an anointed, or the anointed. In fact, the word Mashiach in Tanakh is never referring to who we call the Messiah. Never. I know this sounds strange to the viewer, but as it turns out, the word Mashiach in Tanakh is referring to someone who is anointed for the purpose of having a leadership position. Most frequently, it is the priests, people like myself, people I am a descendant of, people who are descendants of Aaron. The word Mashiach, therefore, appears in the book of Leviticus more frequently than any other book in the Bible. Look it up for yourself. What Christian Bibles do, the usual suspects, the New American Standard and the King James and the New International Version and the Living Bible and all these wonderful Bibles, in 37 places translate the word Mashiach as anointed. But right here in Daniel 9, in the two places it appears, they deliberately translate the word Mashiach as Messiah. They're not done yet. They want to make sure that this scam sticks, that it has traction. So they capitalize the word Messiah. For those who don't know this, there is no such thing as a capital letter in the Hebrew language. So that's a complete human manipulation. It's a complete human iteration. It's done for theological reasons. This is why I can't blame Christians. Wait, the scam continues, because they then put the definite article saying the Messiah. It doesn't say the Messiah in the original Hebrew. If you look both at verse 25 and 26, the word says there Mashiach. It doesn't say the Moshiach. It doesn't say the Ha-Moshiach, the anointed, or the Messiah. So they insert in a definite article, which is really important in Hebrew. Incidentally, in Hebrew, there is no such thing as an indefinite article as we have in English. So a definite article is really telling you who. So I can't blame Christians for what they believe. And I can't blame Christians for being angry with me, unless they'll listen. Just look it up. That's all I tell people. Please look it up for yourself. Rabbis want to be unemployed for a lack of customers. We want to empower our students so they can read it themselves. They don't need us. There's nothing that makes a rabbi, nothing gives me more pleasure than one of my students becomes wiser and more knowledgeable than me. That makes me the happiest person in the world. And then what occurs is, I don't want to get too complex, I don't want to overdo it. There are two anointed ones spoken of here. One who's Cyrus, who gives the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, and we're told it will be restored, but in troubled times, because the Second Temple is marked by tough time. We had a Second Temple, lasted 420 years, but with the exception of 100 years, the entire Jewish people in the land of Israel lived as a vassal state under another empire, with the exception of Maccabean period, and even then it was a problematic time. The whole Second Temple period was problems. We had no golden era like David and Solomon, which was a period that lasted 80 years, or Uzziyahu and Yotam, very long period. Uzziyahu was king for 52 years. His son was ruled for 16 years. Those are the silver years of the First Temple. Great years. We didn't have that in the Second Temple. It was just problematic. It was very problematic. So what they do is the church can't handle that there should be two different anointed ones. The second anointed one, who is cut off, where is Ikares ve'englo? He's cut off, but not for himself, which means the word doesn't say he'll be killed, rejected. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say any of that. The Christians put that in there. The person who is anointed is the high priest or the priesthood removed. That's who Mashiach is referring to most frequently in Tanakh. What happens? The whole priestly function of bringing sacrifices, all their work that went on in the temple, that my great-great-grandparents fulfilled in the temple, was finished, was cut off. That was the end of it. There are 130 commandments of the 613 in the Torah that are directly associated with bringing sacrifices. The whole enterprise came to a close. Cut off. But the church has to then conflate these two because they need one anointed one, or one Messiah, the Messiah. So they do the unimaginable. They conflate. I don't want to go much further than this. In Volume 1 of Let's Get Biblical, I have an extensive chart that shows this. They conflate the period of 7 and 62 as though it's one period of 69 years. So it says after the 7 weeks and the 2 and the 60. I'm not kidding. So they say an anointed one, a prince. You know how crazy that is? I'm asking you a question. You speak English, you speak Malay, you speak Indonesian, you speak Chinese, you speak German, you speak French, you speak Spanish, you speak Portuguese. I don't care what language you speak. In none of them is the number 69 represented by 2, 60, and 7. In no language. In every language, it's 60 and 9. 69 in German, 69 in French. Okay? So, and no one wonders why this has been completely conflated in verse 25 of Daniel 9. To prove that they're not the same period, and the two different anointed ones, one after 7 weeks and one after 62 weeks, is look at Daniel 9, verse 26. It says after the 62 weeks. It doesn't say after the 62 and 7 weeks. So, and one other point, Christians, listen, if you're not a Christian, just listen. But if you're a Christian, really listen carefully. If really Daniel 9, verses 24 through 27, contain a fantastic prophecy of exactly when the Messiah would be crucified, why doesn't anyone in the New Testament quote it? Why is there not 27 books in the Christian Bible? Not one of them thought that it was important enough to mention that there is a prophecy foretelling the precise date of when Jesus would be crucified. Not only is that doesn't exist in the 27 books of the Christian Bible, it doesn't even exist in the deuterocanonical texts. It doesn't exist in the Gospel of Peter. Doesn't exist. Nobody thought that was important. Doesn't appear in the writings of the Apostolic Fathers. You think Clement of Rome didn't think that was important? This is so ridiculous. This whole torturous circus act, this fake prophecy, was contrived in the 2nd century during the time, essentially, of Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyon, in the second half of the 2nd century. It means what's so obvious is if Paul, who is talking constantly about the importance of Jesus' crucifixion and trying to explain to people why it's so important the Messiah is crucified and rose, you don't think he would mention that in Romans chapter 1 and 1 Corinthians chapter 15? No sober mind can accept this. The church has molested the 9th chapter of the book of Daniel, deprived Christians, their own parishioners, their own followers, their own supporters, of knowledge of the whole chapter, the context of Daniel 9, manipulated the text, altered the calculation in order to advance a Christological fraud. And Christians are completely not familiar with Jeremiah's prophecy because Christians don't read Jeremiah. I'm sorry to say that. Christians don't read Jeremiah. There are a few, 1 in 1,000 read through Jeremiah, and they just read through it and they have no clue what they're reading about. When Daniel 9 refers to Jeremiah, they don't know why he's referring to Jeremiah in the first 2 passages. They don't know. Why? Because they're bad, evil people? No, they were never taught it. Never. Why? Because if they're taught it like I'm teaching you, then the whole Daniel 9 collapses. They don't want it to collapse. The church would rather lie and withhold information from its followers than its followers understand an exquisite, ecstatic chapter of the Bible. I pray that Christians will read this chapter properly in context. They will repent and return to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, reject the odious teachings of the church, the false teachings about Jesus, the idolatrous teachings of the Trinity, the abhorrent teachings of vicarious atonement promulgated by Paul, return to the God of Israel, so that the prophecy of Zephaniah 3 verse 9 will be fulfilled, that all nations will speak in a pure speech. May that happen quickly in our time. Great question.